Welcome to your sock tube. You all have a sock tube that we are going to be separating into two pieces that will allow you to create two socks. I have already done this with one because I have made a sock to show off. I'm doing this all one-handed, so I have not blocked this yet. I'll have to put it on a sock blocker to be able to show it off a little bit better, but here you go. We have our afterthought heel, cuff I came back and added on, and a toe that was added on. We did all of that from just a tube like this. We will walk through the different steps of how to do all the separating, measurements, and everything you need to know in this video. First thing you need to do is figure out your foot measurements. And if you look at the notes that I sent along for this class, it has a little bit of math that we need to do, very basic math, that is how to get the different measurements for making our sock. How much of the tube that we need to use for the leg, and how much of the tube that we need to use for the foot. So the basic math that we will be doing is figuring that out. So we have the leg, and we have the foot, and we have a bunch of other variables in here. The first thing that you're going to do is measure your foot from the heel to the toe. So on your foot, you want to measure from the heel all the way to the end of your toe. And you want to do that with your foot flat on the floor and stepping down. You can put a piece of paper down and put a hash mark for your heel and a hash mark for your toe. It doesn't have to be super precise, but that would be one way to do it. You can kind of just put a tape measure down and stand it on a ruler, something like that. So once you have measured from your heel to your toe, you're going to put it in right there. For me, it's 9.75 inches. Next, you will take your 9.75 inches and you're going to take away 2 inches for the heel, take away 2 inches for the toe, because this right here and this right here is about 2 inches in your knitting. So we need to know then how much of the tube we need to be able to do just the foot. So 9.75 minus 2 is 7.75, minus 2 is 5.75. So my foot needs to be 5.75 inches. It's a little bit different, but we will take how high we want our sock to be. So just measure on your leg. I have calves that bump out pretty good, and so I take my sock leg right up to the bottom of my calf, and then I have my calf bump out. And then I measure from there down to the floor, and for me that's about 8 inches, and that's the total length. So you're going to put that right here. That's how tall I want my sock to be. If you have ankle socks, then just measure it up as high as you want it to go. Mine, I like to go up to the bottom of my calf, but 8 inches for me. Oh, sorry, 8 inches for me down here. How tall do you like your ribbing? I like about 1 inch of ribbing, sometimes 2 inches, but for these sock tubes, I'm doing 1 inch. So I want 1 inch of ribbing, I'll put it there. So I take my sock height of 8 inches, I'm going to subtract my 1 inch of ribbing, that gives me 7 inches, and then I'm going to subtract 2 inches for the heel, because that's how much we have here. So 8 minus 1 is 7, minus 2 is 5, so I need 5 inches for my leg. So 5 inches here, and 5.75 inches here. So I need 10.75 inches total for a tube. If I have a tube here that is 15 inches long, I don't need all of it. I only need the 10.75 inches to get my sock. So what we do in order to get a correct length of tube is we will go first. You can kind of ignore my little heel right there, because first thing we want to do is we want to come down that long and we want to put our dividing line in. And so you're going to run your yarn around, picking up the stitches, and say that is the end of my sock tube. Skip a row of stitches and then put in the next round, which I haven't done yet, so I'll show you how to do it. And then that will create the separation point for the rest of the tube. to go off and do its own thing. And then we will have just that 10.75 inches that we need to do my foot. So let's do that next. How do we pick up stitches on some waste yarn? Get yourself a darning needle, some waste yarn. Best not to have a super pointy needle because you will end up splitting more stitches that way. You will most likely split some stitches of the yarn that we are going to be cutting out anyway, so it's not really that big a deal. And plus, if you split one of the stitches you're picking up, you're going to take this yarn out, so it's not going to affect it. But a blunter needle is a little bit better for doing this. And the process by which we are going to pick up these stitches is we are going to pick up the right leg of the stitch. And as you look at a V right here, there's a V for our knit stitch. A little closer. That's that V. What is going to be the part we pick up is the right leg right there. And this stitch of up here, that's my beginning of round, so that is what I picked up. So I want to stay in that column. So we picked up that one. We need to skip this one because that is the waste, what's going to be waste yarn that we're going to remove and unravel, and then we will pick this one up. I do like these bent needles. It helps to kind of a little more easily pick them up because you can dip and twist as you are working your way around the sock. It helps to have your hand in the sock tube so you can feel on the back here to make sure you're not stabbing all the way through and picking up yarn on the back, in essence sewing your sock tube flat. If you do, not a big deal. We're going to take this out and it'll open it up, but it's just nice to not have that as something that we're adding to a complication, adding as a complication. So just, and if this looks a little awkward, first time you do it, it might be, but I am staring at my camera screen and doing this, so it does make it a little bit slower for me. But yeah, I just twist my needle around, pick up that stitch, pick up that stitch. If you have a bit of a splitty yarn, it may split a little more, still not a big deal. So once you get so many stitches on, it gets a little harder to work and work, so I just pull the yarn through. We're just going to keep working around, and when we get all the way back to the beginning, following along, you will notice that your rounds don't line up. This brown yarn, picking up the last stitch, this out of the way. It's all sticking together. So the brown yarn here, picking up that last stitch, is down here, and that brown yarn is coming out up here. And why is that? That's because as we knit in a circle, we're actually knitting in a spiral that goes one side slightly higher than the other side as you work in that spiral. So even though you've joined in the round when you're knitting in the round, it's still going to be off that little bit when you work your way around, because that's what we're creating, is a spiral. So when you get all the way back around, your last stitch you're going to pick up is not that one right there that's in line. It's going to be one row lower. You can see here we've picked up that one. We're going to skip that one, pick up that one. It's just the magic of knitting. So let's work our way around this tube, picking up some stitches, and I'll meet you on the other side. So what happens if you pick up the wrong leg of a stitch? That's such a great question. If I go in, pick up the right side, that is picking it up right so that the stitch is sitting correctly on my needle. So picking up that right stitch, and we can see that the stitch is opening up. But if I pick up the wrong leg, There we go. Sorry for the focus. Picking up that wrong leg. If I were to try to knit that stitch, it would knit twisted. So what you have to do is, if you do happen to pick up the left leg, not a big deal. You just fix it when you go to work your round of actual knitting, or when you're transferring your stitches to the needle off the yarn. You just fix it then. Same thing, if you happen to miss a stitch completely, you just fix it later. When you are oh, I split my stitch. See, that happens. So if you split your stitches you're picking up, that's not really a big deal because you're going to remove this yarn. Or if you are putting it on needles instead of yarn, you just fix it when you get to it. Not a big deal. I think you can, if you come across a stitch, live stitch that's not attached to anything, you can always pop a locking stitch marker in it or a split ring stitch marker to hold it until you get back to it. No big deal. Or tie it with some yarn if you're worried. It's easy to say pick up lower, especially if it's not a striping yarn where you can see the color that you're supposed to go to. You can kind of see I've drifted. Now there's 2 rounds between that brown yarn and the one I'm picking up. If that happens and you've gone all the way around, when you're unworking your stitch, because maybe you drifted down and you went back up, so you end up in the right spot over here, but as you're unraveling this yarn, you'll find it. You want to try to make sure that as you go around, you're staying in line. And one way to do that is to get yourself some locking stitch markers. Yes, this is a sewing needle instead. And you can put it in place so far along, because if you were to take something straight and you find your line of stitches that you're going to follow, you can say, okay, I'm lined up. I can take my locking stitch marker that I never seem to have, and this is the line. I can say, okay, I'm gonna work my way to there, and then that's your reference point. You're working along, and if you don't line up right there when you get there and you're a little low or you're a little high, then you only have to back up a little bit and fix it. Reference point stitch markers, you can do them 1/4 of the way, halfway, and the 3/4 mark, and then that way you can fix any kind of drifting that may happen before it becomes more of an issue. And so sometimes it's nice to have your hand inside the tube to be picking up stitches. It's a little awkward for me working around my camera doing that. If you do it flat like I'm doing it, you can just check every now and then, pulling it apart to make sure you haven't snagged the back of your tube. I'll show you how we deal with a missed stitch later on. But if I'm coming around like this and I say, oh no, I've missed a stitch completely because I didn't pick up either leg of that, that's again, grab yourself one of those locking stitch markers and pop it in there. And that's really your fix that you're going to want to do, because until you're putting these live stitches on a needle instead of waste yarn, you really can't fix that. So that's really the fix that you need to do for that, is get yourself a locking stitch marker. Or in this case, I mean, there's always so many ways to do it. You got a little bit of yarn, you can just make that, pop that in there and leave it on just that yarn. It kind of helps to pull a little bit as you're stretching out. I kind of like pinch on the needle and pull here, and that kind of pulls and opens up that stitch a little bit so I can cleanly slip the needle in. So this is what we will do working in this waste yarn for all the parts. And again, you can use a needle if you'd rather use a needle. Pick it up, you pull some stitches onto the cable. If you're using circular needles, doing a 9-inch circular, if you like to use those, might be a little bit tricky. It's not impossible, but it might be a little tricky. You might want to, if you're going to do a 9-inch circ, have a needle tip cover so it keeps the stitches on as you're working your needle around, and that would be one way to do it. Double points I found to be the most challenging for doing this because they are not flexible. So it's kind of okay to do it picking up one round as you go this direction. But man, picking up for a heel, that was a bit of a challenge because the yarn makes it super flexible, so you can manipulate this, and you also don't have the cables hanging everywhere and the needles banging and bouncing off of something. So using the two yarns makes it very nice to have a lot of flexibility. Working a double point, picking up the stitches for a double point, because I was using 4 double point needles to do my heel, so I had 1/2 of the stitches on one double point, and I split the 2 stitches, or the stitches on 2 double points for the other one, so I'd have 3 working needles and the 4th one to be the active needle. And it was just like fighting and fighting and fighting. It is doable. It is not necessarily the most pleasant way to do it, we'll say. Do what your tolerance level allows you to do. This I find to be the most relaxing and easiest and flexible, because I also don't tend to like yank this out as much as I would like a circular needle sometimes, and just pull it all out and it's like, okay, start over. We are on target to be slightly below there. Last stitch. There we go. Slightly below. Pull that. And we have ourselves set up to now be able to pull up a stitch and cut. Once we have ran that second line, whether it's for separating the tubes, or you can see when we put in for the heel, we have an end here and we have an end here partway through our tube, and we're still going to end up with these 2 opposing lines with a separator line in there. That's what's going to become our waist yarn. That's what we're going to unravel and create the intentional hole in our knitting. So when we get down here, this is the beginning of round, so this is the halfway point over here on the left side, and it's a good idea to start over here and work your way this direction, because you need some of this waist yarn, what's going to become waist yarn, to weave in your ends at the end. If you started over here, you would end up with no yarn to weave in the ends. So you want to start at the halfway point when you are unraveling. So you just come over here, pull up a stitch, get yourself a big loop like that. Get yourself some sharp pointy scissors so that you can easily slide in there and give that a cut, so that you are now free to unravel that yarn. So once you've cut that yarn, you pop your hand in the tube, wiggle your finger in there, and that'll start the unraveling process. Let me just grab a spare darning needle, and you can use that to unwork that row of stitching. That's a stitch I missed. So you just get yourself something to put that on hold, and we'll get back to it. No big deal. I think I snagged. There we go. So I snagged that ply there when I was putting in that one. So if you come across a snaggy ply, you can just snip it and keep going. And as you unravel your yarn, it's going to tend to come apart because it's losing its twist. You're having to snip a ply every now and then. Not a big deal. this is going to get woven in. As you are working to unravel this, when you are going from one side to the other side, say separating a tube, you're going to have a lot of extra yarn. So you can trim some of this. You only need, 6-8 inches of a tail to be able to weave in your ends. So that's not that many stitches. My round is over here, so somewhere in here I can cut off the excess. So if you find that as you're unraveling, this tail is getting longer and longer, and each little pull is taking longer and longer, it's because you're unworking about half a yard. So that starts to get a little more of an annoyance. Just go ahead and trim off that extra yarn. You don't need it. Only save, somewhere in here. You can kind of pull a little bit. That separates that two sides and elongates the one that you need to unravel. And just pull them apart. Bam. One becomes a sock, the next one would become a sock normally, but since this is the excess for my second sock, I was trying to think of what could you do with this, because if you have a 72 stitch sock, or even a bigger one, you may need more than the mini skein that you've been given, because you got 25 grams of yarn. I was able to do on my 72 stitch sock a slightly deeper heel, there's a toe, a conventional wedge toe, and about 1 inch of ribbing with 12 grams. And this is 25, so this is about 12 grams left. And that will be just enough to do the other heel, toe, and cuff. But let's say you're running out, you can always use some of your excess to do the cuffs. So the process by which I do it is, once I get the tube separated into its section, I'll pop in my heel, and then what you end up doing is, for the toe, you can then try on your sock, and if this is too long, you can unravel a little bit and back up, because you don't need that length. Or if you put on your sock and you're like, whoa, I measured wrong and my foot's not going to be long enough, you can always come back and add some rounds before you start your toe. You put in your heel, you put in your toe, put in a heel, put in a toe, and then come back. You can adapt how much ribbing you can put in. Say you took a 100-gram tube and sent it to someone or 100-gram skein, excuse me, and sent it to someone to tube. You're not going to use 50 grams for each foot necessarily. So you have the option then to pull from the end of the tube, because one end of the tube will unravel very easily. You can pull from one end of the tube and add that yarn in for the various parts. That's one possibility. So there's several options in there. But for what we're doing, I'm not going to need this extra. So I was trying to figure out, well, what could we do with that little bit of extra that everybody's going to have with their sock potentially. And I think you can turn this into, say, a bottle koozie or a can koozie, which you would just take the stitches that are live and add a bottom to this with some scrap yarn that you have. Just a flat circle. You could do it squared off if you want. It's not going to matter once it's stretched on to the bottle, because it's basically like putting a hat, the crown of a hat, onto this. And then the other end, you can do a bind off that allows it to roll like that, or you can add some ribbing. But if you did the exact same thing, you could use it as a ball tender, where you pop your ball of yarn in there and it keeps it from turning into a big mess. So how do you figure out where the heel placement needs to be? That's the next step. Let's clear up our workspace a little. So we measured on my foot that it was from one end of the sock tube to the other was going to need to be 10 and 3/4 inches total length. So the heel will bisect this area, giving us a couple inches to have for the leg and the foot. And so placement of the heel is done by figuring out where our beginning of round is. And you can establish that pretty quickly by finding where your tail of yarn is and saying, that's my beginning of round. And you'll put a locking stitch marker in that stitch to show you that that is your beginning of the round. Of course, I have no locking stitch markers because I moved recently and I have no idea where anything is still. The other thing I do is I put a stitch marker somewhere up here to say top of the tube. That way I know when I'm putting this in, I don't put my toe here when I should be putting my cuff, because that's 3/4 of an inch difference. So you wanna have that little bit of extra sanity in your life. So pop in a locking stitch marker here. So with the locking stitch marker being in our very first stitch, which is right there, it's that one right there where that little tiny little brown tail is poking out. So that's our beginning of the round. So that one is the column, because you see all our column of stitches. We're going to follow that column down however far we said for placement of our heel. One of the things that we do though is in this pattern, our beginning of round would be right here. My sock is a 72 stitch sock. Typically you use 50% of your stitches, so we're going to say 36 stitches. So if you're going to do a 36 stitch heel, that would be starting here and working to the halfway point. You're going to want to pick up stitch 72 and 71 as well, because this is a technique that's used to have no holes that you need to go back and sew in later. The things we want to do before we cut and do anything with this heel is we know that this is the beginning of round. So we put our locking stitch marker here, and then we follow that column all the way down. I'm trying to just do this to show you. There's lots of ways you can follow your column, but we follow it and we follow it. I'm going to keep following it to the end of my tube, because what we want to do, that's that one right there in the middle, is when we get down here to the end of the tube, that's where we're going to want to pop in. You see, that's where my tail of yarn is. Pop in a locking stitch marker in that stitch before we do any cutting or anything, because what that's going to do for us is that's going to line up the beginning of round to the heel so that the heel is evenly spaced and lines up well with the toe. You are off a few stitches this way or that way, your toe is not going to be completely in line with the heel, and so it's going to be twisted on your foot. So let's talk about the heel a little bit. So what we did is, once we found our beginning of round stitch and decided that's where that is, we start 2 stitches back and we run yarn all the way around to the halfway point, which you can have a stitch marker in there too for reference. And we pick up 2 more stitches, and then we come down and you shift down, and then you can work your way back across this direction. So for removing the separator row there, you come to the halfway point of your heel, which is right here when you fold it over, and you just pop in that separator row, get it in there, pull up that stitch, pinch it right there. And then snip that. So now we're gonna unravel the heel. Remember those extra 2 stitches that we picked up? If you've put in a locking stitch marker that says, hey, that is my halfway point, we do not unravel those last 2 stitches. This is a technique that will allow us to not have a hole that we need to sew in later when we're weaving in our ends. So I'll show you how to unravel. So I unraveled down here, and I am unraveling up here. And now that stitch right there is completely free. That's the halfway point. And we have these 2 stitches still have the unraveling round. It's still in them. And if you look right here, that one needs undone. And so we pull that, leaving those 2 stitches still holding the yarn. Pull that, and you can tuck that in to your tube to weave in later. I'll get you a close-up shot. So you have those 2. There's still a stitch right there and a stitch right there in that separator round that are holding those in, because when we come back around and we are putting this on the needle to work it, we're still going to leave that in place. And then when we work our stitches and knit them, sorry for the shadow, that's going to fill that gap. There will be no hole. So that's a nice little technique. Okay, we're getting close there. So this stitch is the one I want to leave alone. So I need to undo that one. And then down here, there's a half a stitch more that needs unraveled just from that stitch right there. There we go. And you can see once they're knitted, there's no hole to go back and sew. We just follow along with our knitting needle, and you can undo this waste yarn as you go. I don't. I will just keep going, putting these on, and if I happen to snag that waste yarn with my knitting needle, it doesn't matter because I'll just cut it out later. You may split your working stitches. It's okay, because your first round of knitting, you just fix it then. There's those last 2 stitches. All right. So we now have all those live stitches on our needle. So we can come over here to this halfway point and pull out our waste yarn. We're ready to go. We grab a ball of yarn, load up your stitches on your needle and get working in the round. So that's the first, there we go, sorry. That's that first stitch, and it's gonna look really funky and weird, and you're just gonna wanna knit it like normal to join the yarn. Leave yourself a decent enough tail to weave in ends later. And work 1 round of knitting. 1 round of knitting. This is where you can correct any stitch that's twisted. If you come across one that's backwards, you can knit through the back loop to correct it. Or if you're not comfortable with that, you can just get the stitch twisted. You're going to want to pay attention on this round to make sure you haven't split your stitches. If you have, clean them up and then keep going. If you are wanting a deeper wedge heel, because a lot of times people don't like short rail heels, afterthought heel kind of thing, because it's not deep enough, and that's an issue I have. So one of the ways to compensate for that is we're working one round of knitting to establish the yarn. Here's those last 2 stitches that are still worked with yarn. I'm just gonna knit them normal. There we go. But I was saying you can add some extra knit rounds in here. So 2, 3, 4 knit rounds, maybe a couple more if you got a really deep ankle. Another consideration is how many stitches you're using for, sorry for bumping the camera, the heel. Typically a wedge heel, which is the same thing as a wedge toe, we'll use 50% of the stitches. We're doing 50% plus 2 extra on each side, which is actually a total of 8 stitches for how big the heel is. So that that'll affect it a little bit, but you can do, say, 60% of your stitches. So instead of doing, for a 72 stitch sock, instead of doing a 36 stitch with 2 on each side, you would do a 44, let's say, and then that would give you a much bigger distance to cover to get down to the few stitches that you will Kitchener closed at the end. So let me grab this heel. So because your heel is going to be wrapping around on both sides. It's kind of hard to show. Your heel is going to be wrapping around on both sides more. So this one is the 50% plus 2 on each side heel, but I have one that I just worked in this yarn, and it definitely wraps around. It's got a lot more of the sock I did. Sorry for the cable in the way. I've got this one at 60%. So the height here, you have a lot more decrease rounds you can do. So the height here gives you that deeper heel. There we go. So if we line these up, see, you get a little more room in your arch area, because in the instep actually, because if you have a high arches, sometimes the space here isn't enough, and that's something that I have an issue with. So from this point to this point on your typical afterthought heel doesn't work too well for me, but by adding some rounds here, that gives more distance this direction, so that helps with giving it a little bit more. But then adding more stitches on both sides, then the heel is even deeper. So there's a lot of ways to alter your heel to fit your foot. A lot of people have no problems doing a wedge afterthought heel, which is what I have used as the basic. That's pretty standard. You'll find it all over the place. But there's a peasant heel you can do, which has decreases a little bit different on the sides, but again, you might need to give yourself a little bit more room in it. There are also a lot of heels that could be done slightly different shape. You can do like kind of like a star heel, where instead of having decreases on just the sides, you have decreases in 4 points, so it gives you a spiral top effect, or spiral heel effect, and that just, it changes the shape. Now our heels are not a wedge, but this stretches to accommodate the heel, of course. So different types of heels will give you a little bit different shape, a little bit different stretch factor. All right, made it to the other side. Bam. That's our first round. Now you can work a few extra rounds if you feel like you need that extra depth. When you're ready to put your toe in place or the cuff, find yourself that beginning of round. So that's my beginning of round. That's where the working yarn is coming out of. And you'll think, wait a minute, the working yarn is on the left. The working yarn's always on the right, and we're working that direction. Well, the way a sock tube is cranked, it ends up being the opposite. So you always end up with needing to pick up and start your toe in your cuff where that stitch begins. And then you just work your way around, picking up your stitches, just like we did for the heel. Pick the stitches up, put them on here. We'll pull out that brown waste yarn, and then from here, that is your beginning of round. You'll have your stitch marker in there, and then you'll follow the toe decrease pattern that's in your notes, which try a different toe sometimes. Some people like star toes. Some people like a more rounded toe. Some people don't like to Kitchener, so they don't like to do, top-down socks. But it turns out doing a Kitchener doesn't have to be done. Yeah, there's 3-needle bind-offs, but there's also just round toes or just the star toe, and you go down. And it's like doing the top of a hat. So give that a try. Look up a few different things, and then see what you think. When it comes time to do your cuff, if you're doing it in a different color, one of the things that you're going to want to do is once you get your needle in and you've picked up all your stitches as you work your way around, your first round using the other color, you're going to want to be a knit round. And that is because if you were to just start in on knitting and purling for ribbing, you're going to end up having pushed some of this color forward in a purl bump. So you can see here I seem to have a nice dividing line of colors, and that's because I worked one round of plain knitting in the brown, and then I started my ribbing. Work one round of knitting at the top for your cuff, and then work as much ribbing as you like. I did the 72 stitch sock with a 75-gram tube and the 25-gram mini, and I weighed it and checked it, and I was like, yeah, I can do about 10 rounds is what I got in a 2x2 ribbing. Different ribbings require different amounts of yarn, so 1x1 could be a little bit different, 3x1 depending on what you like to do. Jenny's surprisingly stretchy binding lap. I like it. Some people don't like it because it gives a little bit of a flare. I tend to pull a little tighter when I do it, so it keeps it a little bit neater, but you can end up with a really floppy top with that particular bind off. But try snugging it up a little bit, and it can help to keep it from flaring. You can also do a tubular bind off if you want to finish, and that'll give you a different look. You could do a picot bind off. You could do a rolled hem. You can just do it so, like the Rose City Rollers pattern and some of those, you can just end up having, a roll at the top of your sock, and then that gives you that nice little, especially if you're doing like a shorty sock, that'll sit above your shoe, and it can look like that. So this is the tube once it is I went ahead and put in all the lines. So I started by taking out the waste yarn and putting the waste yarn that comes on the tube, and putting the live stitches on some yarn so that I can easily load those onto a needle when I want to. I came down and I put in the dividing line. You know, once I measured my 10.75 inches for my leg and my foot, I put in my dividing line, and then I put in my separator line so that I can cut the tubes apart. Came back in, put my heel in, then put my other heel in and the other separator line. And so one of the things, if you want to do it this way, where you just put all these lines in first, is then you can come back and do your counting. So initially, if you measured my 5 inches for here, I can actually count that number of rows, which for me it turned out to be 60 rounds of socks. So when I threw this dividing line in, I counted down 60 rounds, put in my stitch marker, counted down whatever my foot was, which was like 68 or so, and then counted the 68 rounds here, and then go from there.